Okay, people, I am back, and I am going to start this over again. Give me just a minute to make sure it's on all of our sites that we have it going to. So I'm going to have to go through things a bit faster than I thought I was going to because of that little 5-minute break. Thank you, Emma, for taking my place up there with the teenagers. There it is. Okay, so there's that. There's this one, and all right, I have them all going. So we're going to do this. We're going to go to get this going. Vocabulary you need to know: comic, short comic book, comic strip, often serialized, usually monthly for comic books and weekly or daily for comic strips. Comic books often contain long story arcs. Comic strips, not necessarily, although you will find it happens quite a lot. Graphic novel, a self-contained story told using pictures, often in comic book format. This is generally the way you can tell the difference between a comic book and a graphic novel. A graphic novel is one story contained, is one story. Well, comic books are going to get intertwined stories. It's not always true, but that is a good way of thinking of it. Then you have the manga, manhwa, and manhwa. I completely messed up how to pronounce those, but my tongue is dry and I've been dealing with those with the craziness that is upstairs. But those are Japanese graphic novels, Korean graphic novels, and Chinese graphic novels. Specifically, we will be going over more of the history of Japanese graphic novels, manga, later on in this. So your pre-1900s origin and history, sequential storytelling, and a visual medium is not exactly new. We have everything from cave paintings to Roman carvings to sequential tapestries to Bible leaflets. In fact, right over here is a rather infamous little one-panel comic. Those started getting popular in the 18th century. This is a pretty famous one from the American Revolution, Unite or Die. In 1890, this is when you get your first multi-panel newspaper Comic Cuts, that was published in Britain. Now we hit the 1900s. The first standalone comic magazine, what we would call a comic book today, was published in 1933. It's Famous Funnies, a carnival of Carnival and Comics Famous Bunnies. Other famous ones that started an explosion of comic magazines. You get stuff like The Adventures of Tintin. The first full-color comic was printed in 1934. It was Famous Bunnies #1. It was an Easter color printing. Then you start getting into what today are the two big comic houses, which is Detective Comics, aka DC Comics. Those started printing in 1937. And perhaps the most famous one, and that started the whole superhero genre, like really blew it up, is in 1938. April 18th, 1938 to be exact, was the publication of Action Comics #1, starring Superman. Another famous comic book hero, Batman, was introduced in 1939, Detective Comics #27. Then you get timely publications. Now, you might not recognize timely publications because they've gone through a couple of names. They were first Timely, and then they go on to be called Atlas, and now modern day Marvel Comics, which is owned by Disney. Their big hero at the time in 1939. Remember, we haven't hit Captain America again yet. He was in the 1940s, and we'll see him in just a little bit. The 1939 was Submariner. He was actually the most popular comic that they actually produced was Submariner. Now, this is also called the Golden Age of Comics. The exact start date is disputed, but many agree that it starts with Superman, so 1938. Captain Marvel was actually more popular than Superman during the debut. However, Superman did reach popularity. This is when you got things like radio shows, such as Superman versus the Clan of the Fiery Cross, which was in 2000s made into a graphic novel comic book edition of Superman versus the KKK. It was originally a radio play, Superman versus the Clan of the Fiery Cross. This was also the heyday of horror comics. This is the stuff that inspired the Creepshow TV show, inspired Stephen King and John Romero, plus multiple other horror authors and horror directors and screenwriters. So this is where you're getting stuff like Strange Tales and this was before the whole this is when you're getting Tales from the Crypt, Eerie Comics, EC Comics, The Vault of Horror, The Haunt of Fear, The Crypt of Terror, which then became known as Tales from the Crypt. But these actually started to decline after the introduction of the Comic Code Authority or the Comic Book Code Authority. We will get into that later. 1940s and World War II. This is the birth of comic book characters like Captain America. He was originally published in 1940. Fun note, Captain America punched Hitler before the U.S. was in World War II, nearly a year before. This is also when we get the first Green Lantern, Alan Scott, who is very different than the other Green Lanterns that we've had. If you're interested in that, I consider looking it up yourself. He is very different than the other Green Lanterns of the Lantern Corps that we have today in DC. Now, this is where we start. Then, of course, Pearl Harbor happens, and America gets into World War II. And there was things called the Writers' War Board that was made to produce propaganda for the United States and the Allies against the Axis. This could be anything from selling war bonds to not talking about the war because loose lips sink ships. In this propaganda, often the Axis powers would be depicted as extremely aggressive or as monsters or alternately as being stupid. So this is where you're going to get a lot of racist archetypes, especially against the Japanese. They're going to be very yellow-skinned and, please forget my language, but very squinty-eyed and yellow-skinned. And the Germans are going to be, you can see here in this example. This is the, it's one of the Captain America comics. Here's more examples. Here's where, for example, Batman and Robin selling war bonds. Keep those bullets flying, keep buying war bonds and stamps. Or Superman actually like bending a Nazi tank, or the whole thing with Captain America fighting a Nazi group. And look, they look green like monsters. And then you'd have just very American superheroes like Miss Victory, or team-ups with like they're all fighting like the US Army headquarters and they're taking over the Japanese Imperial Palace. This is kind of propaganda examples. And then there were also softer ones, or given value of softer, more things like showing people how to help on the home front, doing your own farming, growing your own vegetables in victory gardens, sending off your extra produce to help in the war effort and keep the soldiers fed, that kind of stuff. That was kind of what you would see down here with the more softer comics. Less, oh, go, fight, go America, and more, here's what people do at home to help the war effort. Things like this, or Minnie Mouse at home saving her bacon grease to send off to be made into explosives. That kind of thing. Following the end of World War II, this is where we get the birth of what we consider modern-day manga. Picture storytelling did exist in Japan before World War II. It exists in all cultures, pretty much. After World War II, or in the post-World War II era, when they were being not invaded, but when the U.S. military was there making trying to keep them from going back to their imperialist ways. The Allied occupation of Japan. That's it. There were a lot of comics coming in from like the American soldiers, and that actually was an inspiration for some of the way the artwork took a turn from for the Japanese manga. There was a lot of censorship at the time, nothing that could glorify war, nothing that could glorify battle, so you're getting a lot more pastoral and day-to-day life stuff, which is where Osamu Tezuka and Machiko Hasegawa come into play. That's when you get Osamu Tezuka with Mighty Atom, or as we in the West know it, Astro Boy, and Machiko Hasegawa with Saze-san. Saze-san was about basically the day-to-day life of this young woman. And of course, Mighty Atom or Astro Boy was really pushing towards peace and peaceful resolution. 1950s and 60s is when you start getting things like the rise of the younger generation. There's shonen and shoujo, and we'll go over those terms in just a minute. Then in the 80s, you get the rise of realism. That's when, if you ask people who have watched a lot of anime and have read a lot of manga, there is a very specific like 80s era or 80s style that you can definitely tell that an anime was made in the 80s. This is around the time that it started to get a real rise in popularity in the US. This is when you started seeing more translations, started seeing anime actually come over. People are seeing Dragon Ball Z and Dragon Ball and Sailor Moon. So that sort of kicked off the anime and the manga boom. And I say the anime and manga boom combined because a lot of anime are based on manga. This also is when we start getting the sometimes manga would get released multiple times because it would be due to having different translators. So you could have editions that were done by translation, and not all translation was the same. There are some very, very bad translations. Then in the 2000s, this is when it really kicks into high gear. This is when I remember seeing it like a lot more just in basic stores like Walmart. You start getting into the more mature themes. This is stuff like Full Metal Alchemist, Bleach, stuff like that. In the 2010s, you're starting, before the 2010s, there was this thing of having long, drawn-out arcs. Inuyasha took like over a decade to get all the way through. One Piece is still ongoing, has been ongoing since I was in middle school, and I am 38. And One Piece is still not done. But as we get into the 2010s, we're starting to see more shorter, with a definite beginning and definite endpoint that come through fast, like Haikyuu, Demon Slayer. So that's more in the 2020s. But they're coming out not faster, but it's like a shorter narrative, going from long drawn out arcs to something more with filler in between to something that's more concise, a lot shorter. The 2020s, it's the era we're in now, you're just going to be seeing more things with focuses on side characters and side characters getting their own arcs. This is stuff like before you'd maybe get something for a deuteragonist, your antagonist might get an arc and your protagonist would get an arc, and everyone else was just kind of flat. Now you have stuff like Demon Slayer, where every member of the Demon Slayer Corps has their own arc in the manga, or My Hero Academia, all the characters have their own arcs. So that's what we're seeing more in the modern days, having more, like, you're going to still have your protagonist and your antagonist, maybe a secondary protagonist or you do deuteragonist. But the other side characters are going to get their own development time. All right, here's some art. Here's some examples of like how the artwork has evolved. Going from the 1940s and 50s, you get really simplistic. And of course, I hit a button. Hang on, give me a second. All right, you go from really simplistic to you're still getting the big eyes, but you're more softer. This is when shoujo starts getting introduced. Then in the 70s and going into the 80s, you start getting more realistic style. Then in the 90s, you're getting that flamboyant style back. 2000s was very minimalist. 2010s, the artwork just keeps going different tracks, especially from the 2000s to 2020s, because you're starting to see a lot more introduction of digital art over hand painting and hand inking, hand line art. It's going from that to more digital art. So that's why you go from like these styles into like dan currently. All right, terms to know for manga if you're going to get into this genre and you want to understand it more. Kodomo means a young child audience. This is your stuff like Doraemon, Hamtaro, and Pokemon. Shonen is the adolescent male audience. This is usually like, I'm going to say like your YA, your teen-ish kind of stuff, or like tweens and teens. This is your My Hero Academia, One Piece, Bleach. Then you have shoujo, which is the adolescent female audience, which is the same equivalent for the male. This is where you're getting Sailor Moon, Fruits Basket, or On High Host Club. Then you have seinen, which is the adult male audience. This is stuff like Akira, Berserk, Vinland Saga. Now, they don't all have to be necessarily violent. Those are just the three examples I use because people know those three. But you're going for a more male-oriented audience. This is going to still have action, but it's probably going to have more mature themes. Then you have stuff for josei, which is the adult female audience. That is stuff like Pet Shop of Horrors, Nana, Paradise Kiss. Those are the three top ones that I found, and the only one I've actually read is Pet Shop of Horrors, which tells you right off the bat that not all of them are happy sparkle smiles. Then there are ways you're going to see them put together, literally put together. Let me change this real quick. Okay, so this is Naruto number 1. It has several chapters in it. Those chapters would have been individually published in something like Shonen Jump. Put together in this format, it's called a tangoban. Now, what if you have multiple of those volumes put into one book? Then you have something like what we have for our Dragon Ball collection. See how thick it is? It's about the size of a regular novel. That is a sign that you probably got your hands on the bunkoban, which in this case it is volumes, tankoban volumes 4, 5, and 6. Now, mind you, this is I'm being very fast and loose with the like exact definitions, but that is what you're going to find. Is you're going to find there's the tankoban, which is usually has like maybe like 5 or 6 chapters in it, and then you have the bunkoban, which is going to have a whole bunch more chapters, or even just whole volumes of tankoban in it. Bunkoban, like I said, bunkoban are usually thicker. They usually look more like a standard novel. And then there's the term mangaka, that is manga creator. It can refer to both the artist and the writer if they are separate, or it can just be the writer. I've seen both. So, like, for instance, Akira Toriyama for Dragon Ball, he's the mangaka. Also about manga, unlike American books, which you would read in this direction. No, you actually read manga, most of them nowadays, from right to left. So you'll even read it across the page and then move on to the next page. And usually in the very back of the book, there is a like guide if you've never read manga before on how to read manga. All right, next slide. Now we go into the Silver Age of comics. This is when the Comic Code Authority is in full swing. This is where you're going to start seeing censorship. We'll get more into that later. This is where you're going to see artwork start shifting to more realistic and complex drawings. You're going to start seeing more sophisticated storylines. This is where the Flash introduces multiple timelines or alternate timelines, and the comic book industry has never let go of the idea ever since. There was a slight dip in the popularity of superheroes after World War II, but they're starting to see a resurgence. Part of that is pushed by the fact that they're getting TV adaptations. This is when you see things like Adam West Batman, as pictured here, or the Wonder Woman TV show, or the Superman with Chris Reeve. They start getting movies. Superman with Chris Reeve. This is also when things like underground comics start happening. These are the like comics that wouldn't get the Comic Code Authority, and they're like small press and like very limited area, limited runs. A nickname I have found for this era is the era of camp. So this is where you're seeing like Green Arrow with his boxing glove arrow. This is where you start seeing that kind of stuff show up. Or the Joker from Adam West Batman. I just can't think of this time period without thinking about Adam West. I'm sorry, he is stuck in my head. All right, now we're going on to the Bronze Age of comics. This is the age, this was from 1970 to 1985. This is when you're starting to see more mature storylines. You're starting to see more character-driven storylines. No, do not get me wrong, Batman, Superman, all the superheroes, all the comics before this, they had their characters, but these are like more less something happens and the characters are reacting to it, and more the characters are the focus. This is also when you start seeing stuff like social commentary getting more pronounced. This is when you start seeing Spider-Man, X-Men, Iron Man and his alcoholism, and Spider-Man and the infamous drug comic. We'll get into that later. It's very funny. You're also seeing more writer-artist collaboration. Before, it would be like a writer would write and then the comic house would assign an artist to it. Now you're getting writers and artists working together. Sci-fi and fantasy start becoming more popular. This is when you're getting stuff like Conan the Barbarian or, say, like Star Trek comics. And this is also the birth of the female version of male heroes. This is your Spider-Woman. This is your Supergirl. Things like that start appearing, as well as minority heroes. And we're starting to see a return of horror. And we're starting to see more comic book adaptations into films. Which leads way to the modern age of comics, 1989 to present. You'll notice there is some gap between years. There is some overlap. Like the Bronze Age didn't stop in 1985, and then the modern age started in 1989. None of the other ones have. It's more like millennials and Gen X. You have, there's overlapping years, but there's like 1 year that they say starts it. So in this case, it's 1989 to the present. This age of comics also has its own nickname, and that is the Dark Age of comics. Not because of how bad they are, or like no one's buying them, quite the opposite. It's because we start seeing the dark storylines. This is the heavy rise of anti-heroes. This is the Punisher, although he was being published before this, but like V for Vendetta. This is also when you're seeing the death of major characters. Dear Lord, the death of Robin. If you guys don't know your Batman lore, after Richard Grayson went off to Bloodhaven and became Nightwing, we got a new Robin, and that was Jason Todd. At the time, the writers and artists asked people what they wanted to see happen, and Jason Todd died. He was killed by the Joker. So that was a whole plot line that would come back later with the Red Hood, Under the Red Hood. Can you tell I am a Batman kind of fan? This is also when you're going to start seeing more like blockbuster level movie adaptations of maybe a wider range. Like before, we were just getting superheroes, and yes, there's some superheroes listed on my list. But you're seeing stuff like Constantine, V for Vendetta, Sin City, and then the grandpappy of the, and then the granddaddy of them all, the Marvel Cinematic Universe comes out. Yeah. So movie adaptations really get a push in this era of comics. This is also where you're going to see things like variant covers, limited print runs, special printing, things like that. You're going to get collector's editions, even though those existed before, but now they're more like, you'll get like omnibus formats that have special covers that you can get. We're also seeing the rise of trade paperbacks. Comics, they're getting. I don't have any on me. I forgot to grab one when I was on my way down. But this is when you're getting like multiple issues put into an omnibus, or you'll have it like in a graphic novel format instead of a monthly to monthly comic format, which still exists. You can still go to a comic book store and get a like Superman number. What are we at? 300 something. And you can get that issue, or you can go to the comic book store and get like a storyline in a book, like the death of Superman will have its own like one. This is also when we start seeing, well, this happened before, but now we start seeing more often things like creator rights disputes. I highly recommend looking them up. This is things like Spawn, for instance, McFarlane versus Gaiman versus McFarlane, about who owned certain aspects of the characters that were created, whether they belong to the creators or whether they belong to the publishing houses because they were created under contract. It gets complicated. I'm not going to go into it very far, but it does make for very interesting reading. I can recommend that you look up some history of comics websites to dip your toe in more. All right. Going into the late 90s and into the 2000s, we start with the rise of the internet, which also brings the rise of webcomics. You're going to see things, a lot of the ones I've seen from this time period are things that are very techy, user-friendly, the infamous loss, things like that. But they start losing popularity after social media starts really taking off. That's when you're going to start seeing things on Patreon or getting Kickstarters, that kind of thing. Another one I forgot was Penny Arcade. You're going to see a lot of gamer-focused web comics coming out in this time frame. Some of them would come out and they'd like try to leech off of other ones, and then they just crumble away into nothing after they stop getting support. 2014, a website opens and it is called Webtoons, and it is from South Korea. This is like the new age of webcomics. They are being published as books. We have several of them here at the library. For instance, this one I have on the screen, Crumbs by Danny Sterling. They aren't like just Korean anymore. There are English creators. There's all sorts. So that is the current new age of webcomics. All right, I did say that we were going to talk about censorship. This is the Comic Code Authority, which was partially started due to the question, do comics cause violence and other undesirable attitudes in the youth? The Comic Code Authority was created in 1954 by the Comics Magazine Association of America. So you can kind of think of it as the MPAA, the Movie Producers Association of America, for comics. But instead of having like, you have your G-rated films, your PG, your PG-13, your R, your NC-17 ratings. No, instead they just had one stamp and it was approved by the Comic Code Authority, and you had to obey the code Give me a quick second. We are going to share this tab instead. This is the Comics Code of 1954. Thank you to the CBLDF, that's the Comic Books Legal Defense Fund. Thank you to their website. They have it on it. I suggest going through and looking at it. But here are some like standard parts that could not happen or you wouldn't get the seal. Crimes can never be presented in such a way as to create sympathy for the criminal, to promote distrust of the forces of law and justice, or to inspire others with a desire to imitate criminals. Shall not present the unique details and methods of a crime. Policemen, judges, government officials, and respected institutions shall never be presented in a way as to create disrespect for the established authority. If a crime is depicted, it shall be as sordid and unpleasant activity. Criminals shall not be presented so as to be rendered glamorous or to occupy a position which creates a desire of emulation. In every instance, good shall triumph over evil, and the criminal punished for their misdeeds. Scenes of excessive violence shall be prohibited. Scenes of bare torture, excessive and unnecessary gun and knife play, physical agony, gory, and gruesome crime shall be eliminated. You can look on more of these. The letters of the word crime on a comics magazine cover shall never be appreciably greater in dimension than the other words in the title. The word crime shall never appear alone on a cover. No comic magazine shall use the word horror or terror in its title. You can see what I mean about some books from EC Comics going just after the 1950s. This did cause the death of horror books or horror comics. Not death. It caused a decline in their sales. All right, we're going back to my tabs. There was no official control. Like, they couldn't say because you didn't get a stamp you can't sell this comic. But distributors would often not carry titles that didn't have the seal. Now, 1971, the code gets updated. You can blame 4 things for this happening: Marvel, Stan Lee, Spider-Man, and the US government. Before then, drugs could not be in comics at all. Until in 1971, the US government went to Marvel Comics and Stan Lee and said they wanted to do a comic that was Spider-Man with an anti-drug theme. Well, it was sent off to the Comic Code Authority, and the Comic Code Authority refused to give the seal at all. Give me 1 second. I got people asking questions up here, so give me just. Okay, I'm back. So Marvel, Stan Lee, Spider-Man, and the U.S. government. U.S. government wants to do an anti-drug story featuring Spider-Man. Take Marvel Comics and Stan Lee, send it to the Comic Code Authority. Comic Code Authority says, no, we will not give it our stamp. Marvel and Stan Lee look at each other, go, okay, we're publishing it. Now, the Comic Book Code Authority at this time and comic book retailers are now in the bind because this is a comic that has been sponsored by the U.S. government. So the code gets changed. So now, as long as things are like drug use is shown in a bad light, it's now allowed, as well as some other like loosening of the restrictions, which begins the fall of the Comic Code Authority. Publishers start ignoring the CCA, the Comic Code Authority, in about the 80s. You start seeing more of them publishing without the code seal. You see more comic book shops not bothering with checking if they have the Comic Code Authority stamp or not. 2001, Marvel's X-Force was rejected by the CCA. Marvel shrugs, publishes it anyway without the seal, and creates their own internal rating system. January 20th, 2011, DC Comics completely leaves the CCA. January 21st, 2011, Archie Comics, the last publisher in the Comic Code Authority, abandons it. The CCA is pretty much abandoned by everyone at this point. In September of 2011, the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, website I showed you a little while ago, acquires the intellectual rights to the CCA seal, which is where I got that seal from. All right, some terms you need to know for if you are interested in doing writing for comics books, but not necessarily the art. A panel, which is usually a square section of the page. It could be other shapes like ovals or stars, but it's basically just a section of the page. A splash page is a panel that covers the whole page, and a spread is two facing pages of a book. You can have a two-page spread, which is a image that covers both sides of the pages simultaneously. You have word balloon, which is spot dialogue. The thought balloon usually looks like the puffy little cloud. Then there is the gutter, that is the space between the panels. Yep, off panel, or that's when something would be like happening over there and I'd be reacting to it. That is an off panel action. And then there is the narratory block, caption or voiceover. If you are a fan of Deadpool, yes, these are the little yellow boxes. This is text used in the box for narration or voiceover purposes. You'll find it has multiple names, but it's generally going to be the box at the top or the bottom that has words. So when you're doing comic book writing, it is going to be a whole different beast than writing prose, which is your regular book writing. It is usually done in a script format. Are you doing your own art, or are you handing it off? That's going to tell you how much detail you're going to be putting into the descriptions. Prep is going to be key. You're going to want to know your genres, character setting, and your story completely before you really start going into this. Outlines are very helpful. Everything will need to be listed. Everything from what the pictures need to look like, to the dialogue, to the very layout of the page. Now, I have done an example on here. This is from, say, I think my example I used on here is Bram Stoker's Dracula. This would take place like where Jonathan Harker is arriving at Dracula's castle. So you start off with a one-panel wide shot of dark and looming castle with bats flying around the towers. This may end up instead being changed to a splash page with that. Panel 2, a close-up of a wagon wheel with a narratory block saying, had I only known what I was getting into. Now, I label it as Jonathan. It may be that whoever is doing the lettering will have a very specific lettering for Jonathan. So that's why you need to know who is making the noise, who is making the talkie talk, or who the words are coming from. Panel 3, a gloomy courtyard of a castle with a large door. Jonathan stands outside the carriage, staring up at the door. Shot should have Jonathan looking small to emphasize vulnerability in this moment. Sound effect, creak. So that tells the person who's doing the art that I want a huge castle, and then I want Jonathan to be really tiny down here. Still identifiable as Jonathan, but really tiny because I want to get that position of power and vulnerability. And then, of course, having a creak sound effect. Panel 4, Dracula stands in the doorway. He should take up most of the panel to emphasize his power. With the word Dracula, words he says, welcome to my house, enter freely and of your own will. Yes, that is taken directly from the book. When that went off to the artist, they would still have questions, but they would have a better idea of what I'm trying to do with this. So that is today's meeting. We're going to be having one next month that is about the art of covers, or don't judge a book by its cover. It's going to be about cover art, different types of cover art, different places to get cover art, different styles, cover art as a means of communicating genre or reading level. So that is going to be it for tonight. I hope you guys all enjoyed it. I don't see any questions.